The Americanization of Emily is a romantic comedy about D-Day, February 14th, 1944. This is a slightly strange hybrid. On one hand, it's a dark and cynical comedy. It's about the luxuries behind the scenes of a war, about the bureaucracy and cowardice behind the scenes of war just a stone's throw away from the biggest generals, the people who are supposed to be the bravest, but there's something else going on here. Notorious cynic Paddy Chayefsky wrote this movie, and it shows. Even though this is from 1964, it still has a lot of bite to it. On the other hand, it's a saccharine film. It's a romantic film. It's got romantic Mancini-esque score throughout, and it stars none other than Julie Andrews as Emily. What is it like to take these two things together? Well, I'll tell you. The cast of this movie is pretty good. James Garner stars, and, this is a guy that, frankly, I often forget existed, but he's good in this movie. James Coburn is here as well, and I really like his performance. We're also spoiled by an appearance from Melvin Douglas, who is one of my all-time favorite actors, and he's amazing as usual. He just seems to be slightly more alive or more real, have more energy or something than everybody else. Finally, of course, we have Julie Andrews. Although this movie came out right in between Mary Poppins and The Sound of Music, today it feels like a rare glimpse of Andrews before these iconic roles. Before, she was a little bit typecast as a maternal type, I guess. Julie Andrews came to Hollywood right at the end of her 20s after being on Broadway. She would have gotten there a little bit sooner had she reprised her role in My Fair Lady, which she had on the stage. In the film, of course, it's Audrey Hepburn. Maybe you could claim that this movie, The Americanization of Emily, is part of the Americanization of Julie Andrews. Julie Andrews had some setbacks later in her career, and in some ways, her biggest mark would be made just a few years either side of this movie. She was in a couple interesting things later on, though, like 10, which personally I think is terrible, and Victoria, which personally I haven't seen. Let me know if it's any good. James Garner is in that movie as well, and both of those films were directed by Andrews' then-husband, Blake Edwards. Both of those movies seem kind of edgy, and maybe you could put this one in that category too, kind of edgy. The Americanization of Emily is a war movie. It's about World War II, one of the three wars that Bart Simpson considers justified. Most movies about this war are heroic or tragic, which I guess is heroism, but in a minor key or something. This movie is neither one of those things. It focuses on Charles Madison, that's James Garner's character, and he is a dog robber, which is an assistant or an adjutant to a big general, or in this case, to an admiral. And this admiral, you guessed it, it's Melvin Douglas. Madison's role here is not the macho soldier, or sailor, really. I think they're in the Navy. He spends most of his time organizing the general's schedule, his professional schedule, but also his social calendar. He massages the general. He works in an office mainly staffed by women, and he uses these women as dates for the admiral and for the generals that come to visit him. This movie has some frank sexual politics in it, which might be a little bit surprising and a little bit polarizing. It came out in 1964, so we're not dealing with the production code. There is a little bit of doublespeak going on, but it's also clear that Madison is essentially running a brothel for the top brass. His office is full of expensive dresses, exotic perfume, and Hershey chocolate bars that he uses as payment, more or less. The parties that he arranges for the admiral and these swanky dates feature extravagant menus with avocados and all kinds of meats. This is food that would not have been available in England for years. And I guess that's one of the reasons why the women come. This is a dodgy arrangement. And as you can maybe imagine, Madison is a bit of a scoundrel. Yes, he's the protagonist, he's the hero, and he sort of has a boyish impudence and charm, but he is not upstanding by any means. Partly, this is used for comedic effect. I think this was a more common comedy trope back in the 1960s and before. The wheeler and dealer, unscrupulous, but kind of lovable. When Madison needs something from a Southerner, he's going to put on a Southern accent. He revels in always finding the angle, like it's all one big game that he's playing. He's also surprisingly honest about what he's doing. He says that he has no interest in being killed. He doesn't think there's anything heroic about war. This is a hard character to pin down. The anti-war scoundrel. The anti-war scoundrel. It's an interesting one. Now, enter Emily, British, stiff-lipped, and principled. She's a driver in the motor pool who at first vigorously rejects Madison's invitation to a bridge night with the generals. So it's a classic story of two outspoken rivals falling for each other. I think the balance might feel a little bit off these days, though. There's a lot of sparring between Emily and Madison, and I think it's supposed to feel like there's an even back and forth between the two of them, but probably a lot of people are going to like one of them a lot more than the other. Madison's unabashed cowardice and shysterism makes for interesting viewing in 2025. I don't find myself very drawn to this character, but it's interesting to see that these are the traits that Chayefsky posited as American way back in 1964. Self-centeredness, cowardice, interesting. Emily, on the other hand, is easy to root for. At one point, Madison compares her to Mrs. Miniver. That's a character from a movie made during the war, a movie called Mrs. Miniver, what people would call a women's picture, I guess, that film, long before the chick flick. You know, there were women's pictures like Stella Dallas, which I think is a really, really good movie, actually. The original, Imitation of Life, I guess the remake too. Usually these were all about maternal sacrifice, the martyrdom and continual suffering of mothers, good and bad. These are very interesting movies, especially to watch today. Madison continuously accuses Emily of being too high-minded. He says that by celebrating the wartime death of her husband and father, by celebrating their bravery, really, not their death, by celebrating their bravery, she's practicing some sort of sanctimony. I guess today we'd call it virtue signaling. So were these women's pictures all about virtue signaling? It's interesting that we're kind of repositioning both the macho man's role and the domestic woman's role of the 1940s are both kind of being repositioned in this film, part of many reversals, which I'll talk about later on. Madison's arguments here don't really track with me, though. There are moments where Emily has just delivered a big speech. The movie is a little too heavy on speeches, like some other Chayefsky stuff is as well. Emily gives her speech, and then it's over to Madison for the rebuttal, and I think he's supposed to say something that will claw things back to level between them and preserve this tension. But he's not particularly convincing. His reasoning mainly ends up sounding like harebrained justifications for his own lack of courage and principle. And I don't know, maybe you're not supposed to be on board with this entirely. This movie was always very finely balanced between this guy being kind of a schmuck, kind of a fool, and being the hero and this kind of lovable guy. I don't think the balance really works for me, but maybe it will for you. There's one big confrontation between these two characters that really surprised me with its ferocity. In general, this movie doesn't pull many punches, and I was surprised by it multiple times. Like I said, the frankness of the sexual politics in the beginning, the ferocity of their insults of one another, surprising. Partly, the Americanization of Emily feels like a classic movie. It feels kind of old, but it's from 1964, and it has Paddy Chayefsky behind it, so it's pretty raw. Like I said, a bit of a hybrid. I was hoping that this would be a social drama, a psychologically intimate movie, but it isn't exactly in that area. Most of the back and forth in the film is pretty mechanical, like a classic film. So we have things like, well, I'm a coward, but I think it's the people who aren't cowards who are the real problem. Madison will say something like that, because these people who are not cowards, they're the ones who send their sons off to die. No, it's the cowards who are the heroes, not the brave people. And then Emily says, oh, but if you're a coward, well, what about that expired can of tuna you ate last week? That was pretty brave. There's a lot of moralistic jousting back and forth. That's basically the entire movie. And these sort of twists in terms of like the principles that are established in terms of like, oh, you believe this, you believe that. Oh, but what about this? What about that? Like a lot of the plot is just driven on these like reversal of principles and contradiction of principles. To me, maybe not as exciting. There are a lot of reversals in this movie, though. I've mentioned a few of them already. Okay, the military protagonist, who is an unabashed coward. He's doing what people at the time might have called women's work, right? Meanwhile, Emily, she works at the motor pool as a driver. We've got an admiral Melvin Douglas, who ends up being pretty infirm. I'll cut the list short to avoid spoilers, but trust me, there are a lot of reversals in this movie. Some of these structures feel a little bit similar to Network, actually. Okay, where does D-Day come in? I'm not going to go through the whole plot. Don't want to spoil it because there actually are some pretty cool twists here, but the basic idea is that this admiral wants Madison to make a movie, in perhaps another connection with Network, a movie about the first troops on Omaha Beach. This is basically a promotional stunt. The admiral is worried that the Army will try to outshine the Navy in post-war congressional hearings. In this movie, we hear more about the fight between the Army and the Navy than we do about the actual war. And this is part of the satire, of course, but there's also something interesting going on here with historical perspective. The movie conflates D-Day with the end of the war to some extent, and it seems like it's all a foregone conclusion. Hey, we're going to win. Don't worry about it. Maybe that is what it felt like amid the upper echelons towards the end of the war, but it's not the storyline you usually get in a World War II movie. Maybe it's the satire, again, showing us how people take the result for granted. There is not a lot of suspense here, though, which usually is a big part of a war film. The admiral is more focused on the congressional hearing after the war than he is on D-Day itself. Hey, another reversal. This is an interesting spin on dramatic irony. I guess it's common for war movies to have to account for the fact that everybody knows the ending. Usually, they resolve this problem by just focusing on an individual, just focusing on one or two guys, and you get attached to them, and you don't know what's going to happen to them, but they ride through these bigger historical events, right? Uh-oh, don't go near the bulge. Uh-oh, stay off that beach. We have some of this mechanic here, too. I'm not going to spoil anything, but Madison does eventually leave his office and has an ironic brush with history. You wonder how much... Yeah, the interesting historical perspective. Like I said, it kind of takes history for granted. It kind of takes the war for granted. You wonder how much this is actually a movie about the Cold War rather than World War II. The Hershey bars remind you of that. The Hershey bars and the European austerity. Some of these plotlines would be maybe more at home in a movie like Ninotchka. As a historical movie, the Americanization of Emily leaves something to be desired. It does maybe capture a sense of what happens on the home front, but you can find that in other movies as well. I have a video about The Cruel Sea, for instance, which does an extremely good job of capturing domestic and military life and how those things collide with each other during a war. That's a gem. That's a great movie. If you're looking for a historical film, watch that one, not this one. I should give maybe a small shout out to some of the interesting lingo in the film. I don't know if it's realistic, but it's colorful and kind of interesting. There's some nice turns of phrase throughout. Julie Andrews says, "Oh, I don't want to get all sticky with it." Now imagine that, but with her accent. James Garner says, "Well, it's just one of those things." There are also some great TV-friendly expletives in the movie, like feather-headed, they say that a few times, and holy cow, they really go all in with the holy cows. Some nice lingo. On the other hand, it doesn't seem like they even tried to be accurate when they were costuming the film. But hey, like I said, not exactly a historical movie. The style of the film is fine. It was directed by Arthur Hiller, who did The Hospital. He also directed Love Story, a movie I've actually never seen. This movie feels a little bit static at first, but the staging loosens up, and the camera work is fairly dynamic. There are some decent action shots in the film as well, although some of it is clearly sort of spliced in film reels. Some of the romantic music is pretty nice. Like I said, it reminds you a bit of Mancini, and yes, it's a bit overbearing. Strangely, the movie actually reminds me a little bit of Breakfast at Tiffany's. There's just a hint of that. Maybe it's a cross between that film and Dr. Strangelove, but much worse than either one of those. Overall, I would say it's an okay movie, The Americanization of Emily. It surprised me with its frankness. And it's a pretty good satire. Those are probably its main virtues. This movie is was a few years before a lot of anti-war films would really start to get cooking. Of course, those would mostly be responses to the Vietnam War, which was still ramping up at this time, I guess, at least for the US. The Americanization of Emily has moments that I actually laughed at. It is still pretty funny, or at least we could call it amusing. But there are also places where it reverses over itself one too many times, and where Madison isn't quite likable enough to follow him through all these weird sort of hoops that he jumps through with his principles, all these strange arguments he makes. The Americanization of Emily is a movie kind of from a forgotten period. It's interesting to see a look at World War II from this mid-60s period that is still kind of a classic film, but is doing something a little more subversive. It might be slightly hard to wrap your head around that period, but if you can, it's pretty good. It's okay. What can I say? So that's the Americanization of